In this edition of FSW Conversations, I am talking to Michael Spicher, PhD. Michael is a philosopher, consultant, and speaker. He founded Aesthetics Research Lab in 2016 to showcase the variety of ways that aesthetics impacts our lives. He is a co-editor for Digital Fashion, Theory, Practice, and Implications, which came out a few months ago with Bloomsbury Publishing. And he writes regularly for Beauty Matter. He is a lecturer at both Boston Architectural College and Massachusetts College of Art and Design. To start, Michael, thank you so much for joining us today. I would love for you to share what initially drew you to study aesthetics and how has your perspective evolved through the years?
Thank you for having me, Jessica. I started with the question of beauty. I feel like I've always had a sense that beauty was important. I just didn't know exactly why. And then when I realized there's my background being in philosophy, whole disciplinary world dedicated to the study of beauty, the question of what it really is, and a question that none of us have actually solved or anything, but that got me going into that category. And then realizing there's all sorts of other aspects of aesthetics more broadly. I've studied aesthetic experience, taste, the sublime. And I think my perspective initially was committed to, or maybe inspired by the more lofty experiences, like the mountaintop experiences, the amazing works of art. And then I think maybe my perspective over the years has become more grounded in the everyday notions of beauty and aesthetics that surround us in our lives. A colleague of mine, we were talking about this very thing, and she was saying that she thinks sometimes aesthetics is overlooked in our daily lives because it's like air and water in a sense, where every time you take a breath, you don't think, wow, that's the most amazing breath of air I've ever taken. But imagine a situation where you couldn't breathe. Then the first breath you would take after that would actually be amazing. And aesthetics permeates our lives in such a way that we don't often specifically consider it. And so that's where I have been focusing a lot of my energy lately.
One question I have based on what you've just said is, do you feel we're moving away from this ability to appreciate these everyday experiences, either because we're too busy or we're too cynical?
I would say mixed. If I know that's not like a great answer. It's definitely like an answer of a philosopher, like yes and no. Um, but when I first started out, it was very much the feeling of being a lone ranger. Like nobody seemed to care much about aesthetics or beauty in the way that I was trying to make it work. But now there are lots of people that are bringing conversations about beauty into business. I just led an aesthetics workshop at a biotech company. And so I think there's a lot of really interesting things happening. People are being much more receptive to it. I really tend to think that beauty is something that people are turning to in some ways a little bit more because I guess to quote Dostoevsky from his novel, The Idiot, he says, beauty will save the world. And I think at a time where it seems like there's added uncertainty and we're being inundated with more information. Pre-internet, you wouldn't have heard about as many struggles around the world as you can now just by logging into any social media. I think we have a much more acute sense of the problems around the world. I do think, not that I think people are turning to beauty, but I think we're also being very distracted. So I think it's very individual that we have to fight against that and force ourselves to pay better attention, develop better aesthetic habits. And I've recently thought of a phrase that I call aesthetic future, where like we need to control our aesthetic futures by taking intentional steps now and paying attention to how our environment makes us feel and things that we like and developing.
That connects to the wellness movement. I think the encouragement to have people focus on self-care and personal health as a way of safeguarding not only your own perspective, but I think for the health of the human experience in general. So I think that's a really powerful concept. Speaking of things that are uncertain, you do a lot of work in luxury, and luxury brands and aesthetics seem pretty inseparable. How do you see aesthetics shaping the values and the emotional connections that luxury brands aim to create with consumers?
There's a sort of two questions: how I see it shaping, or how I think it should shape. um, might be two kind of different ways of thinking about it. I do think that one of the things, because aesthetic experience is such a crucial aspect of what it means to be human, we need to consider this from the perspective of business. If we want to engage the whole person, whether it's an employee or a customer, we need to consider the aesthetics and not just the more intellectual, or people keep saying things like data driven for a lot of businesses. We need to consider how aesthetics plays a role in all of our entire approach if we want to engage the whole person. I do think aesthetics is one of the key ways that does emotionally connect us to products. I can give you an example from my own life. I was looking years ago, looking for just to get a new leather bag to bring to my classes. We were on one website. We turned to the next page of list of products, and she gasped audibly. And the one that we ended up getting was the leather bag that she gasped on, and it was more than, it was like double what we had originally thought we wanted to spend as poor graduate students. But it's the one we went with, and
Mhm.
we were able to rationalize it later. Could we come up with reasons why we do this? But this is what people don't often consider. There's so much literature from psychology and other disciplines that have basically shown that we don't make rational decisions. We make emotional decisions and then
Yep.
rationalize them after the fact. Even a Harvard business professor named Gerald Zaltman claims that 95% of our retail purchases are made from the subconscious. And so if we want to tap into that, that's where, through the aesthetics of the presentation to the aesthetics of storytelling and every other aspect of it, are all crucial for any brand to really connect with people.
And I feel like we approach things in a very sort of specific lens in my agency because we do content strategy, right? We're looking to help brands take a more holistic approach to content across channels, and storytelling is part of that. I think one of the points you make, I think that's interesting, is you hear so much in marketing about the importance of emotion, as you said, in terms of making irrational decisions when it comes to purchasing and everything else like that. But I think there's a different nuance in what you're saying in terms of this need to take a more humanistic approach. And I know that you've explored the importance of beauty in the human experience a lot. And I'm wondering about that, how this concept of humanism and this sort of whole person approach really translates into sort of luxury branding and storytelling. Because I think you see moments of this from luxury brands in, I think, discrete marketing campaigns. But one of the things we're always, I don't want to say hammering into brands from a content strategy perspective, man, but from a storytelling perspective, I feel like you see moments of this. And there are some brands like Hermes and even Brunello Cucinelli and Loro Piana that do dive into that more sort of whole person emotive state of storytelling. But I'd be interested from your end how that concept of humanism and emotional connection really translates into branding and storytelling on your perspective, and who's doing it well and what are the challenges with that?
I would say with storytelling, one of the things I think people misunderstand maybe about storytelling in terms of branding is that it's not just a way to convey information. That's part of it. You want to convey certain information about your company, about your specific products. But there's a researcher that I've read about where they talk about the importance of making the story aesthetically pleasing in itself. It's not just a means to an end. It should be good for its own sake. And if it is, they conclude that it will be engaging and it will be repeatable. So if you hear a story about a brand and you're already leaning toward that brand anyway, yeah, you might go with it, but it's not because of the story. It's just maybe the story adds some information that you didn't previously have. If a company tells a story and the story is really good, then people will repeat it and engage with it. To me, like, aesthetics is, to use like business terminology, it's like a force multiplier. And
Yeah.
and so whatever you're doing, I pretty much always say whatever you're doing, aesthetics will make it better in some sense. And I think that's where people miss out. They might have a clever story, and there's other things like something that's funny could also have the same kind of thing, but something
Mhm.
that's really aesthetically engaging, I think, pushes it over the edge. And when people remember your story, they do tend to retell it. I've connected with some different people, and I still remember even like the thinnest narrative where it's not like elaborate. That's the thing I think people miss, is it can be very simple.
Yep.
Um, I can mention one that I thought did it really well. There's a company I met the founder in New York at a beauty industry event, and the founder of this company called Fable in Maine. And the story behind the name of the company was just simply he had memories of his grandmother telling him and his sister's stories while rubbing oil into their hair. And it was just this really relatable, story that I remember it several years later. Has stayed with me because it's very simple, but it became the name of their brand.
I think especially in today's creator economy, this sort of notion of narrative co-creation and this need for sort of consumers to participate, but also to have their own stories be part of that. And there's this huge, I think, space where brands, as you say, are focusing more on the broadcast side of things and what they want to say. So I'm just wondering from your end, what are the opportunities and challenges of aesthetics for brand communication within that sort of digital space?
Yeah, I think this might slightly go outside of the scope of your question a little bit, but one of the things I've been really concerned with or thought was strange is because the digital space allows us to do things we can't do physically. I think there's been this over kind of commitment to make everything look sci-fi. And I think it doesn't connect with a lot of people. And so I think that's one of the challenges is how can we still do some interesting creative things that can't be done in the physical world, but we can still maintain and connect with our humanity in the physical world. And I think we've maybe overplayed the novelty of some of the digital aspects and at the expense of connecting with people. Because people, one of the things we know from philosophy and the science of perception is people gravitate toward what is familiar. And so you have to connect something familiar. It can't be completely different, or they'll just feel that's not for me. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges is making sure that you connect with people where they are and guide them into a digital space rather than impose the digital space onto them.
We spend a lot of time working with clients to really, I think, emphasize the importance of these guided experiences. And I think approaching people where they are and not just blasting everything at them, but really providing both the content and context they need within digital spaces to feel comfortable, feel acknowledged, I think, there, and then be eager recipients of storytelling because they're stories that feel like things they know and they want to aspire to.
One of the lessons we know from like actual master storytellers, Kurt Vonnegut, in his guide of, I think, 7 or so rules of writing, one of the rules is write just for one person. And so I believe, if I'm not mistaken, he always thought of his sister as he wrote his fiction. And when we do that, it actually, I think maybe the people might shy away from that thinking like, I want to reach everybody or I want to reach a wider, but by focusing on this, it actually creates a more intimate approach rather than saying, I want to advertise to, 1,000 people. If you focus on, I think it actually does that better and creates this more intimate thing. So I think we can learn lessons from actual master storytellers.
I've been preaching the benefits of narrative marketing for literally 16 years, but I totally agree with you. And while I realize I'm bashing all my UX design friends and the approach that most people take to digital design with generalized personas of audience groups, I think the noise of the current kind of digital ecosystem now makes that sort of, if you will, micro experience creation so much more valuable. And I think luxury is naturally positioned to do that.
Mhm.
We've had enough of perfume ads with Charlize Theron coming out of random pools of gold. I read an article like 2 years ago doing basically an anatomy of a perfume ad. I took a Dior perfume and I literally mapped it on like a literary like story map kind of thing. And it's ridiculous. And there's no plot. I'm not saying that ads any plot, but I think from what you're saying, this ability, I think, of brands to be more specific and honest in kind of that authentic is such a powerful thing. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that your work on digital fashion specifically has gained a lot of attention recently, and you even have a book that just came out on the topic. And I would love for you to discuss what digital fashion means to you and how aesthetics plays a role in its appeal. Ah, the book. There it is.
First of all, I should say that's my chapter in the book is on that exact question. Because when we think about digital fashion versus physical fashion, if it were raining outside and you wanted to protect yourself from the rain and the only thing you could find was some ugly jacket, you would wear it. Even if you hated it, just you'd rather wear this ugly jacket than get soaking wet from the rain. Well, digital fashion does not have those kinds of issues because digital fashion can't protect you from the elements. So what's left when you strip away any real functionality to it? Then the only thing that's left is aesthetics and I think meaning, which I think those are related, but they're still separable. For me, digital fashion is a way that we can learn to create and express our identities and develop our identities without the strictures of the physical world. Even if someone has like a gigantic closet,
Mhm.
it's still limited. You still don't want to waste space in a closet or a house for things that you may or may not actually ever really like. So the digital space gives you an opportunity to develop your aesthetic. It's not fully there yet. So I want to be clear about that, but it keeps getting better and better every year. The other problem is people with their identities, they may feel uncomfortable going into dressing rooms. They may feel
Mhm.
uncomfortable going and buying certain things at a physical store or even ordering them online where you don't know if you're going to really like this. So this gives you a chance to explore in ways that are safer, cheaper generally. There are exceptions to that, but generally cheaper. Gen Z wears a garment 7 times before it ends up in landfill and things like that. And a lot of the problems arise with social media culture. One of the biggest companies, DressX, they basically say if we're obviously not going to not wear physical clothes anymore, but if you want a garment that you're only going to use for a digital purpose, then just get a digital garment. And it's so much better for the environment than something that's going to ultimately end up in landfill. Because a lot of people don't know that people have gained this knowledge quicker in the last couple of years, but that a lot of times if you buy something and then you return it and get your refund, you think, okay, great, that worked. But a lot of times the company just trashes the garment that you sent back and they don't actually resell it. That whole process may have worked on your end, but it still just put a garment in landfill that shouldn't have otherwise been there.
Yeah, definitely. And there are so many important things that you just said that I want to kind of pick them apart a little bit. One of the things you mentioned was just this sort of idea that you can express your authentic self through digital fashion. I'm just wondering, in your opinion, how does digital fashion allow for new expressions of aesthetics, especially when compared with traditional fashion?
One of the key ways is you can do things that you just can't do in the physical world, like sneakers made of fire, a dress made of water. So there's lots of things like that people have done that just can't be done in the physical world. But I do think that each one of us is in charge of developing who we are. And a huge part of that is our aesthetic taste. And part of that is obviously our clothing. In a recent study in 2021 done by a team that consisted of at least a few psychologists and at least one philosopher, they've begun to show that people associate their aesthetic taste as an integral part of their identity in a way that maybe surprises some people. Someone said, my favorite color used to be blue, but now it's green. We probably don't think something super significant has changed about that person. But if someone were to say, I was an atheist and now I've become really religious, or vice versa, or I was politically right and now I'm politically left, or vice versa, we would think something more significant about their identity has changed than just they used to wear a lot of black and now they wear a lot of blue or something. And what people have in the same study also agreed was that if they were to change from listening to classical music to pop music, they rated that as high as changing religious or political affiliations. And so it's not like we love saying things like beauty is skin deep. And I get why those expressions make sense. I think there's truth to some of these cliches, but at the same time, we value our aesthetic taste integrally or intimately tied to our identity. And I think we can't ignore that either. So that's why it's a little bit complicated because on the one hand, we can see how beauty and aesthetics have oppressed others, but at the same time, we also think they're so valuable for our lives.
From just my own personal experience to see how digital fashion can allow that sort of emotional resonance, and I think that sense of sort of personal creative expression. Even the generational differences that you're mentioning there. I'm mother to a Gen Alpha kid who's in Roblox all the time, and watching his sort of evolution from an 11-year-old to now a 13-year-old within a space. I mean, he's quite good at coding. Even within Roblox, when he first joined for years, his avatar was a gingerbread man. And it was just because it made him happy. And then, he recently changed it to sadness from Inside Out. And we asked him why he changed that. He was like, she's my favorite character because she's really kind and she's really nice. And that's the kind of person I want to be. It's a signifier of personality, but I think it's also this sort of space where people can feel comfortable and I think really craft an identity that feels true to them. And I think that is a really powerful thing. And just to move more into sort of the fashion side of things, I think there's a lot of also practical applications to digital fashion from obviously virtual try-ons. My friend Louise Lang and Digital Twin is doing some really amazing practical things to bridge that gap between sort of those digital and physical tools. And just on that sort of fashion as this aesthetic sort of beauty side of things, I'm curious what you think about the idea of digital experiences and that sort of emotional resonance quotient and how they compared with physical luxury items. Because, when you own something, you get that sort of tactical, it's mine, I own it feel. And I'm just wondering from your end, do you feel like digital experiences can ever have that same emotional connection?
I'm very hesitant to say same. My kind of concern with, or my personal feelings on a lot of the digital stuff, not just fashion, but just in general. I guess I think about it in terms of back when people used to own records or CDs, this is mine, I own this. And now we've replaced all of that with streaming. So you just pay endlessly forever. And then if you stop paying, you have nothing to show for it. So I do think there's an interesting challenge here. I know that's, like I said, that's not the exact same context, but I think there's an interesting challenge of there's something tactile about opening something physical that now is something only digital. And the same thing even with going through photographs. Of course, like we're such an image obsessed culture now because everyone has a camera in their pocket, and there's a difference between just scrolling through like the 1,000 pictures on someone's phone versus holding a photograph in your hand. And so I do worry about that kind of like emotional distancing that the digital often brings. So that's where I would be hesitant to say it's the same. But I do think there is clearly emotional connections. And one of the approaches to philosophy started by Edmund Husserl that called phenomenology talks
Mhm.
about intentions and experiences. And this is where I bring this up in my chapter in the book as well. I think for digital things right now, I'm less concerned with like in terms of philosophy, I'm less concerned with the actual nature of digital objects rather than our intentions and experiences. And I think if we focus more on that, then we can get a clearer understanding of our emotional attachments and approach because there is a difference. It's clearly different that you like holding a physical photograph of a loved one that's passed away versus just scrolling through 1,000 photos on your phone of that person. There seems to be something different going on there. And people talk about this with reading books, like holding a physical book versus a digital book. But there's benefits of everything. Like I've heard some people, like especially a lot of academics, just hate digital books. And I'm thinking the one thing digital books can do that physical books can't is you can zoom. If you have poor eyesight, you can enlarge the text. You can't like go on a physical page and move your fingers to enlarge the text on the page, but you can do that on a digital book. I think we're still in a process of figuring out what the digital can do and our connection to it. And that's why I think it's so important to ask, not to fully push philosophy, but that's why I think it's important to ask a lot of these philosophical questions about the digital. It's already overtaken our lives, so it's too late to avoid that. But even as new things come about, like digital fashion, the conversations that seem to have quieted down a little bit about the metaverse, they're still happening. That people don't like that word anymore. And as AI is becoming more and more prominent, I think the biggest question is how do we maintain our humanity while
Right.
using these things are tools. And I think when we think about them more than tools, they're really good tools, maybe, but when we put too much emphasis on them as being more than a tool, I think that's when we get into trouble.
No, and I agree. I'm just going back to too many undergrad classes on like early robots and this sort of need of I've grew up with sci-fi. I've been steeped in it from forever, but this notion that like robots are going to take over the world. And you're stating how I feel about this. I think AI and these sorts of digital tool technologies are tools. And I think when properly contextualized, they can have a lot of power there. I'm just also thinking tangentially when you're talking about this ability of digital, I think create a new role almost within our spectrum of human experience. But I think there's something in this concept of the sort of beauty of the digital experiences. And I think especially for luxury and fashion to inspire practices, more sustainable practices in that aesthetics of beauty, give beauty a new position of allowing people to pause and appreciate that quality and timelessness of luxury. And so I know you work with Cartier and other luxury brands. So I'm curious from your perspective specifically on luxury and this sort of notion of that balance between innovation and timeless aesthetics, because my biggest criticism, which is going to be everywhere in the book I'm writing of luxury, is that the pandemic caused a lot of very poor decision making from a digital perspective. Fashion luxury tends to take a very additive approach to technology and just, okay, this vendor selling me this, I'm going to add this new tool. We're all in the metaverse. Okay, I'm going to go over here. I'm all in AI. I'm now over here. And I think you start to lose this sort of, we're only focusing on innovation and we're forgetting about our cultural values as a heritage brand, or this notion of luxury is elevated. So I'm just wondering, how can digital fashion help luxury find its place within this sort of new world? This notion of, do you feel like digital can help luxury balance that sort of innovation timelessness, or should luxury just go back to being analog?
I think trying to reduce it to an either or wouldn't work anyway. I think some companies feel like they have to do something digital now. And I
Mhm.
think that's a mistake too. Some companies, maybe they don't need to do anything digital. Maybe everything's fine. I don't mean just keep the status quo either, but I think like this, we embrace everything novel. And you see this in all contexts. I was thinking about music. You would see this with trends, like some style of music becomes popular. Then all of a sudden, every record label has their token band that represents that style of music.
Yeah.
And they don't always do it well and such. I think we often jump on board to some new novel idea without any thought. And just because everyone else is doing it, so we should do it too in order to
Yeah.
stay trendy or cutting edge. And I'm just not sure that's the best approach. If you can't figure out why you're doing this, then don't do it. It just seems
Yeah.
obvious to me that or spend some more time thinking about it before you do it. Even if you have a sense like we should be doing this, whatever the new technology is, because we probably don't even know some of the new technologies that might exist 10 to
Right.
20 years from now. I think digital can help with innovation, but if it doesn't keep and maintain the human aspect of your company, then I think you're doing it wrong in some sense. And as people definitely tend to gravitate toward the familiar, digital could be a nice tool to help that along as like storytelling through digital media and so on. Like there's ways to do it, but if your company can't figure out why they're doing that, then I don't think you need to do it or table it for a while and really think through it before just jumping on board. There are so many things that just you see it happen where people dive into something because they feel like they have to, and then it was completely wasted effort, and they just blew
Yeah.
a bunch of money on nothing because they didn't really develop a strategy before diving in. I think people are doing that with AI right now too.
We wrote a white paper a month ago talking about this notion of, within retail technology specifically, of just the tech overspend, if you will. You have brands with overinflated tech stocks because they haven't just bought the new technology, they've bought all of the technology. And it's just, there's no rhyme or reason as to why every team needs its own CRM for this, or this team is in the metaverse, or that team is on Instagram, or we have 3 teams to manage Instagram, and all of this sort of thing. And it can be very expensive, but also I think distracting. And our whole point with content strategy is content is not just digital, right? Content for us is this very expansive, anywhere your brand messaging meets your target audiences, and a sense of needing to tell stories in physical space where your customers are shopping in there and having that feel consonant with the digital experience there. And I think there's been so much attention on what Gen Z needs as that sort of up and coming next generation, which is why you see all these people jumping into the metaverse and trying to encourage the next generation of consumers and focusing on acquisition. But it's like most of the people buying stuff right now are, especially ultra high net worth and high net worth individuals, are millennials and Gen X. And it's this sort of notion of today's consumers have different tastes, and you really need that balance. How do you think a refined understanding of aesthetics can help luxury brands better connect with discerning consumers, understanding that these different generations shop in different ways and have different tastes? And how can understanding aesthetics help understand those audiences with their different tastes?
I think sometimes we jump on bandwagons and it comes off as more very superficial to the generation that we're trying to reach. I think authenticity is something that is very much connected with a brand's aesthetics. And when we change that, not that it shouldn't change over time, that's not what I'm saying or about to say, but when we change it too quickly because we think we have to do a complete 180 to reach someone else, I think it often reads very superficially to that target audience. What we know is that consumers want more of an experience now than they ever did. They'll pay more for that. And aesthetics is a big part of it. And if you
Mhm.
can develop a really good aesthetic strategy for your company, and it's more than just the way your product looks, it's more than just marketing. I'm working on a draft of a book right now called Is Your Business Beautiful? And it's all about these kinds of questions from how to create a whole atmosphere. So it's not just window dressing, as maybe some people have thought of aesthetics in some context. It should permeate your entire business strategy. And I think when it does that, you don't have to convince people. I don't mean like you don't have to market or whatever, but
Yeah.
people see that. It's the same thing with when you meet an individual and they're very genuine. And we're occasionally wrong about that, and we'll occasionally be wrong about a business as well. But it's a similar principle, just doing it on a larger scale.
In applications to business, how are you defining and benchmarking beauty within that context in a way I think that is more open? Because for me, I take a version of beauty that's more kind of inclusive and open, but it's something that is this happy place where everyone can be themselves, be truly expressive, and gets to the core of what's good about human values and all of that. But there is so much to debate within what's good versus not. It's like when people ask me what's good content versus not content, I'm like, it's all relative. So I'm just wondering for beauty itself, especially for business, how are you defining what beauty is first as that sort of concept, like concrete concept to shape the rest of the conversation?
What I do is offer some of the standard characteristics of beauty that have been offered for thousands of years and have been also reconfirmed in new scientific studies, many of them. For example, proportion is one of the oldest, going all the way back to Plato and Aristotle, oldest conditions of beauty, integrity, radiance. Francis Hutcheson and offered the idea that beauty is uniformity amidst diversity. And
Mhm.
so I think that kind of idea, we don't often think of that as beauty, but I think what Hutchison is getting at here is something that is very applicable to the business context. For example, I wrote a short thing about building a good team. Let's say you had to build a team of 10 people and you hire 10 visionaries. Nothing's going to get done. They can all have these brilliant, lofty ideas, but you need a mixture of different types of people. And I think that's what will create what we might not ever call it this. And I don't think we're ever going to necessarily translate all of our language into the language of aesthetics when talking about business. I think it provides a framework for thinking through the business, though. Like part of what got me even to think this way was a book I read called Organizational Aesthetics by Stephen DeGroot. And he's starts the book by saying people often ask if a business is profitable. Then maybe they might ask if it's ethical, but they almost never ask if it's beautiful. And so, like I said, I don't think that's going to become a thing where people all of a sudden, that's like the new language of business is, let's talk about the beauty of this business or that. But I
Yeah.
do think if someone is really concerned about really analyzing the success and how to move forward and things with their business, adding this other framework for thinking about it is very useful. And in fact, Pauline Brown in her book, she thinks aesthetics is like going to be the defining role of business in the next decade. And I think there's something interesting about that kind of thinking. And you see it popping up in conversations more than I ever have before. And I think that's, to me, that's very fruitful. Where I would say is people often don't have the depth of knowledge from a background in aesthetics or studies of beauty. And I think sometimes that's part of the problem is I think we need to gain a better understanding, which is part of the reason why I do what I do is offer workshops and writings and talks on these things. So that way people have a sense like I sort of like this and I don't like that, but they don't necessarily always know how to explain that and put it into language. But there's a philosopher I know, Anne Sophie Barwich, who's specifically working on smell and researching our understanding. And she said what makes people who are like wine tasters who often use smell first, or perfumers, there's nothing necessarily special about them physically. They've developed this ability, and smell is one of the most notoriously difficult to put into words, but they've developed this ability over time. And some studies that she refers to in her various works talk about how within a few weeks, the layperson can significantly improve their understanding and ability to explain what they're smelling. If we can do that with smell, how much more can we do that? It's like a paradigm of how we can train ourselves to be better at aesthetics. We just don't think we need to in some ways.
I wrote an entire book on effectively synesthesia. I agree with that, but I think there's a lot of power for the business landscape in this idea of building something better and that valuable. I think one of the reasons I started my agency in the first place was just this notion that content everywhere is not good. It's very bad. I think one of the reasons fashion and luxuries was a natural place for me post PhD is this notion of that the beautiful exists, at least it's feasible within the construct of fashion and luxury. And it's a place where aesthetics, I think, is contextualized and has business value. One of the reasons we're writing a book on luxury content strategy is because luxury content is really peculiar in a way, right? They're Veblen goods, right? They don't need to exist. We have equivalent products at even of equivalent craftsmanship. And because this brand makes it as opposed to this brand, I'm going to be willing to pay $2,000 for it as opposed to $250. And it's in that aesthetic value, both of the brand story, but also the good itself. And I think this notion of businesses focusing on more value-based experiences for both employees and I think for their overall sort of business outlook has so much power. And I think so much of the corporate culture we've all been raised in has taken that out of us. And I've seen it myself. And this notion of business as this very, I'm going to go there, sort of man-centric type of world. And you have to get everything down on hard deadlines. And yes, it's fine if it looks pretty, but really we need to be, especially now with digital, everything needs to be faster, cheaper, and omni-channel everywhere at once. And I think for luxury, it's a struggle because they're supposed to be focused on the slower, the beauty of it. And I think digital is a space where they get a bit lost at times. And I think for us, at least, content strategy is this notion of having a sort of centralized, integrated framework to drive content planning, creation, and management across channels as that sort of conduit through which luxury storytelling can really start to sing. Because as you say, you can focus on building those moments and not have to be everywhere at once. And I would be curious just from your end, I think I see brands like Bottega Veneta, which now has no social, right? They rely on sort of other people talking about them to build buzz this. And I think this notion of a luxury brand being able to express beauty and create its sort of own aesthetic moments through its culture. And as they move forward to the future, whether or not you feel like people are going to be more selective with digital, or do you think that people are going to start to expand more?
I think people should be more selective with digital.
Mm-hmm.
What you said about it's all about content now is the problem with a lot of it is it's lacking in substance and it's just quantity over quality. And I think that's the biggest, to me, that's probably the biggest challenge of the digital world is that there is this need to constantly put out content and people have grown to expect it, but partly because we played into that. Companies
Yeah.
played into that. And it probably would have happened to some degree anyway, even if companies were resistant to it. So I don't necessarily know how we could have avoided it, but we expect there to be so much content that we don't have an appreciation for quality. But I do think this is one of the things I think when we pander to that mentality, we just become one among many. But when we actually separate our content, it may happen slower. That's the problem. I think businesses don't want that word anymore. I think that's the difference that we need to work on here is people, I think, can weed through the junk. We have to allow them to do that though. And I think when we assume that our customers aren't very bright, it doesn't mean that our business might not be successful. So that's part of the idea of aesthetics in the first place is it's a key differentiator between businesses. And so if you really put some thoughtful substance behind your aesthetics of your business, I do think that, like I said, it may happen a little slower, all things considered, but I think it ultimately be stronger and your brand will have an authenticity that all the people that just keep jumping on the next bandwagon just aren't going to have. So it's a difference between like longevity and like the quick dollar. Sometimes it feels like businesses are just completely short-sighted. I know that's such a generalization.
I get that. No, but I think there's so much in what you say. I think especially for luxury, because look, it goes with all I've been saying about, we say over and over again in Fashion Strategy Weekly that brands focus on the tactics for sort of short-term content marketing. And we get asked in
Mhm.
every single workshop, how do I make my content go viral? And I'm like, do you want your content to go viral? Like, it depends on what your goals are, and it depends on what you're trying to do, who you're trying to communicate with. And we really try to drive home that every piece of content needs a why. And I really love from your end this notion of having an aesthetic strategy to marry with your brand strategy, so that your brand strategy then have that sort of value based lens. Because I think from that, you can start to drive that quality content kind of
Yeah.
down the line via that sort of content strategy framework. So I think it's a very powerful thing. Before I get to my last question, I did have one question on, we've spent a lot of time talking about brands, and you mentioned the notion of consumers themselves not having a lot of education about aesthetics. And I'm just wondering from your end, how do you start to educate consumers in terms of the value of aesthetics, and place it as something that they should value? Because the everyday consumer, even the everyday luxury consumer, is busy, and they're going through the sort of noise of their everyday lives. For the ordinary consumer, and not even talking luxury consumer, what value do you think there is in aesthetics education for the everyday person? And how do we start making that possible?
I think this is where businesses really need to lead. And I think sometimes we assume we know what the customer wants. And there's research to back some of these things up. We have research, but I think there are also people that have truly innovated something. I think that's what we need some business leaders to just do. And so that's one thing. The other thing I would say is take my workshop. But I think the other thing is we need to stop, and this is where I'm not really sure how we could get this out to the masses as part of my goal. I think things like Maslow's hierarchy of needs have
Mhm.
curbed our thinking in the wrong direction. While I get it that if I'm starving, do I need food or do I need to go to an art museum? Okay, there's an obvious question there. Very rarely are those two things actually pitted against each other, though. We should want people to flourish. We know from studying, despite what oppressive regimes may think to the contrary, we know from research that societies where more people have a higher level of well being are better. And part of our well being is having access to positive aesthetic experiences. We know this. It's not a surprise anymore. And so I think that's the first step, is not treating beauty as something that is just added on once everything's going well. And so the importance of aesthetics, even for a few brief moments, are absolutely crucial. When life gets really difficult, people often turn to things like pleasing experiences to help them through it. And often they corresponds with some aspect of aesthetics.
I think there's so much in the power of aesthetics and self-identification, and all of that sort of pulling you out of the darkness. So I have one final question, which is just, what advice would you give to emerging brands looking to use aesthetics and digital forms of expression to establish both authenticity and exclusivity in storytelling? Because we've talked a lot about big brands, and I think there's
Yeah.
a space for people who are just starting out and want to do things differently, and to really, I think, be truly expressive, but also I think use some of the sort of basic principles of aesthetics for business that you've been talking about. So any advice?
A lot of designers think of aesthetics as making something pretty. So you make it work, you spend all your energy doing that, and you just slap some aesthetics onto it. I think that is the absolute wrong strategy. And there's a company in Charlotte, North Carolina called the Bolt Group that I discovered in doing some research on like aesthetics and product design and such. And they basically, on their website, they have several articles saying you need to consider aesthetics day one. I think developing an aesthetics strategy as part of your identity when you're developing and having it as part of the earliest conversations is absolutely crucial. How do you want your aesthetics to be? And we often think of, as individuals, we often think of our aesthetic taste as very passive. I just like this music. I just like this
Mhm.
movie. I just like this color. And there is an element of that. Clearly, like you happen to just come across a song at a store and you connect with it instantly, or you are in a museum and you just see a painting and just connect with it instantly. So that does happen. But I think when we look at the comparison to literal physical taste, if you put food in your mouth, you technically taste it, right? But there are other things, like a lot of the drinks tend to fall under this category: coffee, wine, scotch. When you learn how to actually taste them properly, like a lot of people don't like coffee at first, but then when they learn to really understand the taste of it, or wine or scotch or foods, a lot of people don't really have a sensitivity to all the different ingredients in different food. So you can develop this by being more actively engaged as an individual. So I think the same thing applies to a company. If you're just starting out, you may not have it all figured out, but by ignoring it, you could be missing out on some much more powerful aesthetic component that you're not considering. So I would say making aesthetics part of your identity from day one. And it's more than just your logo and your color scheme. There's a lot more to it. Committing to telling your story, but also committing. One of the things about story that we didn't mention is we often think of stories when it comes to brands as what is their history, what is their mission, and those are all important things. But each employee has their own story, and they're all equally important. So someone that's been at a company for 20 years versus the new employee who's only been there maybe a year or two, they're going to have different stories, and we need to give them time to be able to, and maybe the psychological safety to be able to present their own stories of the company. I think getting this well-rounded approach to aesthetics right away is absolutely crucial for your future, I think.
And look, as a content strategist, if design has no soul and appeal from a thing, it's because a content strategist was not involved, because that's our job. Is to ensure that design is infused with storytelling. But again, content strategy is not about defining those stories. And I think you are quite spot on that brands need that aesthetic framework to really capture the essence of that aesthetic value for their own company. And I also love bringing in the employees and talking about the importance of that sort of internal voice, and making sure that so much of what I think the interesting applications of everything we've been talking about for brands are also on that sort of company culture side of things, and creating a more positive place to work where that inspire people to come every day. And this sense of, again, one of the reasons we do a lot of work on, and I think that whole sort of equation is what you're talking about as that sort of aesthetic strategy. And that becomes a very difficult process for us as content strategists to come in, because this is something brands need to have predefined in the first place as part of their brand
Yeah.
matrix. I love the idea now of an aesthetic strategy as part of brand matrix design, because I feel like it should be such a core part of your brand style guide.
When you're talking about work culture, think about the extent of people working from home. So imagine a company like would have a really beautiful building, but if everyone's working from home, who cares about that building anymore? So how do you maintain a good employee work culture when people are in all these remote locations? And part
Yep.
of that is through story.
Yep.
Even research has shown that research interviewing executives who have made cultural changes at their jobs, it wasn't through data. It was through storytelling and talking about stories of employee success. That's what I was trying to look at. And that was more powerful than just saying, oh, if 9 out of 10 employees did X, then it would lead to X result. No, that doesn't do anything for people. And we know this from science too. A lot of scientists I've talked to have said over the last like 15 to 20 years, they've started realizing what the humanities have known all along, and the power of narrative. If you just present the data of your science to the public, it has almost no effect. But when you just present it in the form of a story, and that's very much an aesthetic approach.
Yep.
So
So I'm going to give you a parting example of one of my favorite brands that does a lot of things that you're talking about. I'm a runner. I run marathons. I'm crazy. But Gooder, they make running sunglasses, and I don't work there, so I don't know. But from the outside looking in, it seems like such a fun place to work. And it's a small-ish brand, but every runner has those sunglasses. And because it's such a micro community, they're all about story. They have this flamingo who's their mascot, and it's just a very happy, kind of very runner centric brand. So if you're looking for brands that do that, they do that. But I think for everything you're saying, I would look at sports as well. And I think it's for fashion and luxury, it's such an interesting sort of place that fashion and luxury brands can learn from, because it's small, but also because it's culture driven. I think those types of micro communities offer so many useful case studies as well. I wanted to thank you so much for your time. This was an amazing conversation, so thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us for another great discussion as part of FSW Conversations. For deeper analysis and insights, please visit Fashion Strategy Weekly at fashionstrategyweekly.com, a media publication of strategy agency It's a Working Title. For questions, comments, and concerns, please reach out to our media team at info@itsworkingtitle.com. This podcast is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all of your favorite podcasting platforms.